What's up? Welcome to my studio. Andy or no.notnow here. We are going to take a look in this video at a track that I just released this week called Harajuku Rain, or Harajuku Rain. To start off with, I should tell you a little bit about the story behind the track or how it came about. I think a lot of creative people will probably understand this. I tend to get ideas kind of randomly, especially at times when it's not very convenient for me. Sometimes I'll get an idea when I'm walking around or in the shower or whatever. So I take a lot of voice memos in public, looking like a crazy person singing into my phone, but it has to be done. Knowing that, I went through a phase. I don't so much do this anymore, but I went through a phase where I took my laptop absolutely everywhere with me, have something on me at all times, so that once I got an idea, I could just get to work on it. That's how this song came about. I was walking around Harajuku. I had just gotten a haircut there. All the best hair salons are in Harajuku, by the way. Yeah, I need a haircut now, actually, for all the topic. I really desperately need a haircut. But while I was walking around, it was raining. It was so kind of dull and dark and grim outside, and it wasn't the usual Harajuku tourist experience, I started getting that feeling that something was going to come to me. So I went into a cafe and I opened my laptop and I had a little keyboard, a little tiny MIDI keyboard, and I just started playing some chords. And this is what came out. So I'm going to play you the original version, the version that I made in the cafe. It's like super rough, super rough. But this is how Harajuku Rain started. This was the first instance of it. That's how it began. That was the first version of it. As you can probably hear, a lot has changed, but actually not that much. Most of the core ideas are still kind of the same. Let's open up the actual project of the song that got released and take a look at what's different and what's the same. So the first thing we're going to look at are these chords, the main chords that kind of underpin the whole thing. These have not changed. These were imported directly from that project, and then I just kind of messed with the patches and the effects and stuff, but the chords are identical. So I'm going to turn all the effects off for a minute. The sound that I'm using is one I use a lot, Native Instruments, Scrappy Mark 1. I don't know why, I just love it. I'm a sucker for simplicity, and just that simple electric piano is just beautiful for me. So anyway, without any effects or anything, those chords sound like this. Now, as you can hear, they're super mid-heavy. It's quite boomy, which is not good. So that's where the EQ comes in. So if you open up the EQ on these chords, you can see the first thing I did with the EQ here was I sucked out a lot of low-end noise. Now, Logic's digital EQ is cool because it's got a kind of built-in analyzer that you can see where everything is resonating. So you can see I haven't cut out that much of what's actually happening in the audio. It's just most of the noise, low end, that we just don't need. Just gets rid of that awful boominess, makes it cleaner. Buses are great for effects. If you look at any of my projects, you'll see I don't put effects on the channels very often. I only put effects on the actual channel when I'm okay with them really messing with the audio. Things like reverbs, delays, anything else, I tend to put it on a bus so I can mix it in parallel with what's already there. So you'll see here the effects on the channel are EQ and isotope vinyl. Now let's talk about isotope vinyl. It's free, by the way, so you can just go get it. This is what isotope vinyl does. So if we turn it off and play a track, turn it on. So it just gives it that grainy vinyl sound. And there's all kinds of things you can do with it. You can fuck with the warp depth and noise. I don't really mess with mechanical noise very often. I don't think that sounds good, but there's loads of things you can do with it. It's a really cool plugin. I like it a lot. So those are the chords. Once the rest of the music comes in, those chords had to be a little bit less arresting. So I actually have them on a different channel with an additional effect, which is this reverb tail. So they sound a little bit different in the context of the rest of the song, but not that much different. You can hear it's basically the same. There's just a little bit of reverb on them. All right, so the second thing that happens is, if you remember the original version, there was this little thing. I took that in and I brought it into Serum. Now, I can already see a bunch of angry people commenting that because I'm using Serum, it's not lo-fi. And you're right. Maybe, you're right. You got a point. It's not lo-fi. Serum is a very modern synthesizer. So yeah, maybe it's not lo-fi. Personally, I don't get too hung up on genres or specific genre rules. I think generally speaking, your average listener is a lot more interested in what comes out of their speakers than what you put into them. So my rule is, if it sounds good, do it. This became something like this. Which, when you bring in the chords, sounds like this. Chords are taking up a lot of center mix space, like they're very much in the center and the focal point of the whole mix. And so anything else, when you've got something that's so dominantly centered, it's pretty useful to send some things left and right and to kind of expand the stereo space, to give the listener an idea of how much space they have in their earphones. I also added another arpeggio, just a simpler version of that. And that was also Serum. But together they sound like this. And chords. So again, nothing incredibly clever here. It's just some chords and some arpeggios. So then you move into where things get a little bit more difficult, and you're talking basses. Basses you have to be super careful with, because they can take up a lot of space in the low to low mid range of your EQ, and it can be very difficult to tame them if you don't get it right. So I'm using the 3-octave sub from Massive, which I use a lot because it's a really solid bass. And I'm also using Serum, and I'm using the sub DSK PRC by Gigantor. And it's, again, a really, really nice bass. But when you put them together, they sound super, super deep. And they're also sidechained to my beat. How all that sounds mixed in together. So it's coming together. You can kind of get a feel for where the song came from now. The next thing that I usually add is this crystal-y pad thing. They don't really add a lot in terms of things that you could hear and latch onto and say, oh, that's that instrument. It's more for texture. A huge element that people tend to miss in lo-fi, chill step, chill hop, all of it. It's often more about how something feels in your ears rather than how musical it is or how impressive or technically musical it is. Good friend of mine, Two Shoes, Twitch streamer, lo-fi maker, summed it up really well. Lo-fi music is like an audio blanket. And it is. It's like this lovely feeling that you get when you listen to it. A lot of lo-fi stuff isn't particularly musically impressive. A lot of it's just cut up from other things, but it feels wonderful. It's got this sincerity and this kind of warmth that's very important. So sometimes it's important to add things that might not contribute musically, but contribute texturally. And so we'll create textures or feelings that you can't really hear, but you can feel. One of the ways you can do that is through these kind of crystallized pads that are just kind of bubbling beneath the surface. In the mix, you won't be able to hear this. It's not very clear in the mix. So we're going to move on, and then we're going to cover a lot of ground here. So the next thing is melodic content. And again, this melody was taken directly from the original demo. Sometimes, even if your original demo or your first draft sucks, even if it's fucking terrible, there could still be things in it that are worth salvaging. So never be afraid to kind of pull it out again and take a look at it. So this was the melody from that original demo. It made its way into the final product. I'm going to bring in everything one by one. Now we're going to get to the star of the show, the beat. Now, beats are hugely important in this type of music. Even like the big playlists for this type of music, the names often have the word beat in them. Like the beat is the driving force behind everything else. If you have killer chord progression and a sick melody, but you've got a super bland, uninteresting beat, you're not going to win anybody over with that. So your beat is vitally important. So let's talk about what's going on here in terms of the beat. I'm going to give you a quick breakdown of how I usually go about making beats. The first step is figuring out what feel you want it to have. Again, going back to that word feel, it's so important. So what feel do you want it to have? When you decide what feel you're going for, like, okay, maybe this is going to be like a kind of a boom bap vibe. In that case, you're going to want a kick that has a lot of punch, and you're also going to want a snare that sounds like super crispy. Or maybe you're going to say, okay, well, actually this one, I want it to have a super ambient chilled out vibe. So it's like, okay, in that case, you're going to need a super subby bass with like no top end on it and lots of clicks and kind of ambient noises. So the first question is, what do I want this to feel like? It's something that people miss, but feel is so important. Then once you've decided that, you can go into selecting what samples to use. There's a bunch of different ways to make beats. Some people use like 404s or Machine and they play them in one by one. Some people sample them themselves. Some people use sample packs and they take the audio and drag and drop it. All perfectly fine. There's no right or wrong way to do it as far as I'm concerned. Whatever works for you. I use Battery because it's just super convenient to use. Yeah, looking at this, like there's a lot of stuff here that I took in that I didn't use in the end. My method is I'll just go through as many samples as I can. Anything I like the sound of, I'll drag it in to the project so I have it there in case I want it. If I use it or not, doesn't really matter because it's there if I need it. Let's just watch this and see which ones I actually used, but I don't remember. Okay, so it seems like the mains we're using are these two kicks and this one. These are both from Native Instruments. These are Battery samples. Let's break it down what we got here. So I'm going to solo some of these so we can listen to them. Right? So the beat is actually not that complicated. I'm going to click on so you can see how basic this is. So it's super basic. There's nothing crazy going on. Really, really simple. Let's talk loops. If you want to use loops, you don't have like access to huge amount of samples and you want to use stock loops, totally fine. Go nuts. Use the loops. That's what they're there for. I personally don't use loops often. Sometimes I do. I have nothing against the use of loops. I just don't personally like them. I like to be in complete control of what my beat is doing at all times. I want to be able to go in and take the hat and move the hat around without fucking anything else up, for example. So I don't use loops, but that's not a statement against them. So I'm going to talk about how I went ahead and created this beat, which is essentially a 4-bar loop. My method is I will go in, I will start small. I'll create 2 bars. That's it. The next thing I'll do is I'll go to the next 2 bars, copy paste that, and bring it in, move the next 2 bars. And I'll just take bits of it and like shuffle them around. Like I'll just take bits of it and move them around and change it slightly. My rule is that I will usually do that 4 times and then copy this kind of 4 2-bar loop sequence. This 4 loop sequence will now be the guts of my beat. And there's a reason I do that. One of the downsides, in my opinion, it's only my opinion, to using like 4-bar loops as opposed to creating like these 2-bar loops that differ slightly is listener fatigue. Listener fatigue is a real thing, and it's something that a lot of lo-fi guys and Chillstep guys don't worry about, which I guess is fine. The expectations from the genre-specific audience aren't really too worried about listener fatigue, I suppose. But it is real, and if it's something that you want to avoid, like me, this is a way to do that. Every 2-bar loop may sound quite similar, but actually they are distinctly different from one another. Just by doing that, just by making every 2 bars slightly different from the last 2 bars, you will avoid the whole problem of listener fatigue. So let's look at all that together with some Cymatics Rain samples. Now it's starting to sound like the song you know, right? So the last thing I want to talk about is this. Don't be afraid to wear your influences on your sleeve, right? If you like what one specific artist is doing and you want to emulate it, I say go for it. Like, it's not about copying, although so much of this music is about lifting directly from another recording and chopping it up and making it new. So even there's an argument to be made. But anyway, I'll give you an example. I am obsessed with the 1975. My friends, my bandmates, all fucking hate me for how much I talk about my love of the 1975. So one thing that they did, not so much anymore, but certainly in the Music for Cars days and the first album and a little bit in the second album and then not so much anymore, they had these kind of synth licks in the back of the mix. So you'll have the central performance from the band and the vocalist and the musicians, and then like hovering around in the back of the mix around here somewhere, there would be like this kind of synth voice, almost improvised feeling melodic content. I try to include it in stuff where I feel it's appropriate, and I did here. So again, we're using Serum, filtered using Soundtoy's little alter boy to kind of really fuck it up and kind of chop it up, make it choppy and weird. Now, I didn't want it to be the focal point of the song, right? Kind of ended up being the focal point of the song, but that wasn't my intention. My intention was to create this kind of ghostly, haunting synth element in the mix. But in the mix, it ended up sounding like this. So yeah, really nice, just kind of fills out the rest of the thing. Now, 2 more things to talk about very quickly. Here you'll notice it's a piano section that I have been avoiding the whole time. The reason I've been avoiding this is because this isn't actually in the song in this form. The way I work is I will create an arranged session like this that I will make everything in. I will bounce out every instrument or sometimes group them together if I can, and then do a mix session, like a separate mix project. When you're going to chop shit up, chopping MIDI up isn't nearly as efficient as chopping audio up. If I know I'm going to chop stuff up and flip it and reverse them and mess around with the audio element of it, I much prefer to do that in a mix session with an audio file. The reason I haven't gone into this piano section very much is because this isn't actually how it came out in the actual song. And also in the actual song, it's not such a very important element, so I don't really feel the need to talk about it. It was really just to add a little bit more mid-range texture to the chords and the motion. The only other things worth mentioning, I guess, are these 808s. I have an 808 on every chord change. The 808s are cymatics. Cymatics just make great shit, man. Check them out. And the last thing I want to talk about is these two bars here. We're using a piano. It's a Maverick, I believe. Yeah, it's a Maverick, Tranquil Maverick. And then the una corda. And the una corda is one of these native instruments that gets overlooked, and I don't know why. It's a beautiful instrument. It's a prepared piano. And you can go in here and mess around with the fabric that's layered on top of the keys and stuff, and you can mess with everything. It's beautiful. So I have the una corda panned very, very heavily left, and the piano, the Maverick, panned very, very heavily right. They're basically playing improvised variants of the same thing, and what it creates is this kind of strange, unified, but also slightly separate element. And again, because they're panned so sharply right, and these chords, the main chords are still centered, it creates stereo space for the listener to kind of focus on. So this is what it's happening. And then with the chords. That's pretty much it. That's how I made the track. But that's basically how it all came together. If you have any questions or comments or criticisms, feel free to drop them into the comment box down below. Subscribe if you like what I'm doing. It really, really helps out. And yeah, hopefully we can do some more of these making beats in the future. So for now, Harajuku Ame or Harajuku Rain is on Spotify, Apple Music, Amazon, all those things. Check it out. If you want to remix it, drop a comment, let me know. I'll send you some stems. I have no problem sharing my shit. And for now, see you later.